Hi, welcome. My name's Gavin O'Meara. I'm the CEO and founder of FE News. This is the Future Apprenticeships, season 3. This is episode 3, and this is all about the cost of living crisis, impact of the cost of living crisis. We've got two really interesting guests, and I've also got a really cool co-host. I'm actually live from Singapore. So I've been away at the Global Lifelong Learning Summit in Singapore, and that's with ILO, OECD, loads of different governments, and I want to bring something in around that near the end of this episode, so we're going to extend it a bit. But this is all about the cost of living crisis, particularly in apprenticeships. We're live. So we're actually Singapore Wi-Fi is meant to be renowned to be the fastest in the world, apparently. So let's see if that's the case. We're really going for it. We're checking that out, and you're able to get involved. So audience, we would love to be able to answer any of the questions or any points that you've got. Normally people start to put those in about 20 minutes when we've got 10 minutes remaining. And if you keep them quite short, because if they're really long, it gets a bit off-putting if it covers your face. So for us, we're going to be covering today around the cost of living crisis. Now, if you've been checking out FE News for a week and a half, 2 weeks, you would have seen the Campaign for Learning report, Learning in the Cold, the cost of living crisis and post-16 education and skills. Now, we had, I think, 17 different stakeholders from our ecosystem in further education and skills. When I explained that to people in Singapore, seeing as this is loads of global players in our sector, they couldn't believe how rich our ecosystem is in the UK, and I just think it's just really interesting of where we're sort of going through this whole cost of living crisis. It's affecting everyone, but we're thinking about apprenticeships. And from the very get-go in this season, we had John, who is an apprentice, who mentioned something: jobs for survival versus jobs for progression. And I think that was this really interesting point that John made, and I just want to sort of focus on that today for our stream. My co-host is Michael. I'm going to just bring him in to the studio. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Hi, Gavin. Yeah, really good, thanks. Temperature's a little bit lower here in Newcastle upon Tyne than it is where you are.
Yeah, we're 30 degrees here. Sorry, just to really wind everyone up. But Michael is head of policy at NCFE. I know loads of people on the in the sector know Michael already, but we've had many different dimensions and articles from the Campaign for Learning report, but I didn't know if we could maybe talk about cost of living. And I know you did a session quite recently as well around impact for learning and employers, and particularly around solutions. I didn't know if you wanted to sort of step into that a little bit at all, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. So we had a session at the ALP conference earlier in the year, and it was really to start to look at exploring the particular ways that the cost of living crisis would impact on education and skills in particular. So I learned a lot just from engaging with people who work in the sector and getting all those different perspectives. And what we did is we looked at some of the supply side issues that we have, so some of the obvious ones that a lot of our providers will be aware of. Everybody's got an increasing cost base now. Everybody's got their electricity bills to pay, and of course, I think generally the sector has done a lot with very little over the last decade or so, really. And that those increased cost pressures are creating a lot more uncertainty for providers. But actually, it was really interesting, in particular for me, to explore the demand side pressures actually. And we looked at that in a sort of segmented way, looking at learners, parents, particularly of sort of 16 to 18-year-olds, and employers. So if we look at that in terms of apprenticeships, obviously learners themselves under quite a lot of pressure. We know, for example, the apprenticeship minimum wage is a lot lower than the national living wage. We also know that the apprenticeship achievement rates are not as high as everybody would like them to be, and that there was some speculation about whether learners might be leaving their apprenticeship to take a higher paid role on the living wage elsewhere, for example. What was clear is actually there's not enough of an evidence base to be able to tell some of that stuff. But anecdotally, there was definitely some stories there. Looking at the pressures on parents and households as well. So particularly for a 16 to 18-year-old apprentice, that family would face losing some of their benefits, for example, child benefit, if that learner starts the apprenticeship. So that does impact on the household income. And as we all know, parents have a huge say in the sort of route and destinations that learners take. It's really, really important to think about, some of those levers that government have there as well. And finally, employers themselves, employers, obviously they're the ones who create apprenticeships in the first place. Employers don't really have much choice but to pay their wage bill and to pay their utility bills. So, apprenticeship and training budgets kind of come last. So, again, we're worried about that downward pressure on employers for both creation of apprenticeships and also work placements, which, they're not free. They do come with a cost as well. So we explored a lot of that. And I think, we were trying to be really positive for this session, but it's important to look at the issues so we can kind of target those interventions at them. But, we did get, a flavour of some of the things that people are doing to support.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think also this is coming out in the streams as well, isn't it? I think also Lucy Hunt, from NHS, largest employer in the UK, was also finding from some of her research that she did for a level 7 was around the impact of parents on the choices of learners on their different routes and stuff like that. And I think that's really interesting as well. Should we bring in some guests? Because I think there's so much we could cover today that I think it'd be really cool to bring in our guests. So we've got Aidan and Becci. So Aidan Relf, I've probably known for 19 years, which I think I was a little bit lighter in colour in hair at that time, and probably a lot skinnier, to be honest. And there's Becci Newton as well from IES. Now, you would probably know IES from loads of the ONS stuff that we do around Office for National Statistics that give out the monthly sort of details. IES always do really cool insight into different elements of what that means. So Aidan, I want to bring you into the studio. Becci, if I could bring you in as well. Good morning. How are you both?
Yeah, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning. Great to be here.
So I don't know, Michael, did you want to kick off with a couple of questions for everyone? So I think there's so many different elements to this cost of living that we need to sort of explore this. It affects everyone, doesn't it? Learners, parents, employers, and also, not being funny, it's going to be affecting the government as well, because people ain't going to be able to pay so much in to be able to take out. I didn't know if you want to kick it off at all, Michael.
Yeah, very happy to. So we sort of finished off there talking about the creation of apprenticeships and employers. I wonder, how do you think that increased business costs will impact on the availability of apprenticeships?
It's likely to have an effect, is sort of my opinion, and the effect will kind of impact most, I think, those using apprenticeships as a labour market entry route, and particularly the group that I think I would like to be encouraging to use apprenticeships around the 16 to 19-year-olds as a really valuable route to get into the labour market. Also the 19 plus, but again, I guess for employers, they're going to have a higher training fee, particularly as they edge up to using our degree level apprenticeships. So we've got a lot of richness in our kind of apprenticeship offer, but obviously a lot of cost differentials in that, and also a situation where the growth in apprenticeships, in recent years really has been in those who are aged over 25 and already in the workplace. And I can just see employers feeling that's the least risky route to doing training, rather than bringing in people through the apprenticeship offer.
Yeah, Aidan, any views?
Yeah, I mean, we're about to get the announcement at lunchtime that interest rates are likely to go to 3%, and there was an economist on the radio this morning, city economist, saying they could be 5% next year. So that's an added business cost to any business that borrows. What I'm hearing from providers that I work with is that already things like energy bills and so on are already impacting, and that sort of level of high staff turnover that we were seeing earlier in the year with a record number of vacancies and so on is beginning to slow down. And that inevitably, I think, there are two things which employers look at when they're faced with mounting bills. One is that their marketing and PR budgets tend to get cut, and so do their training budgets tend to get cut. So I think we might, although we're supposed to be still sort of at the tail end of the peak season for apprentice recruitment, we might be seeing a flatlining after all the sort of increase that we've been seeing over the last few months since the lockdowns ended. I think it's too soon to say how serious that might be, but there's definitely scope for concern.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like you're saying, around interest rate costs, but also energy costs. There's been some things put in place, but also there's uncertainty. If you're a business, there's been a rapid change of government, hasn't there? Which is then something's been announced, there's not announced, there's not, and I think it's just sort of. It also depends if you've got a buffer as well. If you're a large organisation, you'd hope that they should have larger buffers than those that are, say, an SME that maybe, have seen their energy costs quadruple. And then, what does that mean for them around apprentices or this bound to be around or anything like that, really? It sort of relays me into the next question, really. And Aidan, I think it'd be good to kick this off with you. And Michael and Becci, please feel free to jump in as well. But off the job. So the off the job element for apprenticeships, could this be affected during a period of rising costs? Could we be going into a time of recession? People are sort of not really mentioning the R word, but what would that mean for off the job potentially, Aidan?
It's definitely an issue, and of course the rules for 2022 to 23 tightened up still further on the 4-week rule, active learning, and so on. I won't go into the details about that, but as far as what we're talking about today is concerned, and heading up to Christmas, employers are reluctant. Well, some employers like hospitality and retail, which are already under a great deal of pressure as it is, it's a challenge to release their apprentices to do the off the job. Now, I am hearing, in fairness to the government, that the 6 hours a week average is a rule that's easier for employers to understand, and it is an average. You across the whole program, you should stress that. But this issue of being able to release apprentices so they don't do their off the jobs during peak periods is a challenge for employers. And I know of providers who started conversations back in August with their employer clients about how to manage off the job in the run up to Christmas. So definitely a challenge.
If I can come in, I think one of the risks sort of on to sort of young people involved, and also the costs employers face when they talk about apprenticeships. It's the wage bill that they mostly focus on, and SMEs particularly, whereas the funding surrounds the training costs, and a lot of that will be met by government, or if they're large, through the levy. But what there also is evidence on this off the job that quite a lot of employers aren't paying their apprentices the money they should to cover that off-the-job training. So I don't know. I mean, it feels like that's a real issue for the quality of the apprenticeship that we need to get right. They need that off-the-job training, and it's a really necessary protective factor for young people that they are paid for that. If they're not going to get off-the-job training, but they might get paid if they're on the job, I don't know where that leaves us. I feel that's slightly odd, but we've also seen completion rates are pretty low, only 60% completion rates at the moment. They're lower for the 16 to 18 group, so it doesn't feel like that's going to promote good outcomes for young people currently involved in apprenticeships. So there's sort of quite a lot of perverse incentives going around in there, it feels like.
Michael, anything you want to add? Because I think this is interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of probe a little bit deeper actually into to what Becci's mentioned 16 to 18-year-olds a couple of times now, and I think in terms of the group of apprentices that we might be most concerned about, it might be in that age group. I was interested in your article in the Campaign for Learning paper, Becci. You talked about the need for more evidence around that age group in particular. Could you kind of talk about that a little bit and expand on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to say is this group are the ones most likely to attract the apprenticeship national minimum wage rate, which, so we know, is £4.81 per hour. Now that's against a national living wage rate of closer to £11 per hour. So this group is very low paid, and I think it's done on the assumption that they are living in a household with parents who can afford to support them, parents or carers. But we really don't know how far that is the case. It's really hard to understand who this group of young people is. I mean, when I was thinking about this, I went back to some research we'd done around 2006 to understand the difference a financial incentive was making to young people who were not in employment, education or training, and in terms and in that context of their household circumstance, and it's intuitive that those who are able to rely on parents who have a reasonable kind of household resources, the impacts of these cost of living crises that we're seeing are more manageable. But those young people who are living independently or trying to build lives, or actually in very low income households, this is all going to be a bit of a struggle. I think in the household context, there are kind of disadvantages where young people go into apprenticeships. It's kind of assumed that apprenticeship wage rate will compensate for some of the benefits loss that will be seen, and yet we know this is very low paid. I understand that, because you need to train to become productive. But even so, the kind of risks involved in those different financial levels and different pay rates are quite great. And I really think we need to understand much more about this group of young people. We know some of them are on level 2s. We know, although we've seen median pay increase for 16 to 18-year-olds in apprenticeships, that's pulled up by those training at higher levels. So we know there's definitely a group who have probably come out of education with lower attainment, and we know there's a track from that. Apprenticeships can be really protective, can sort of help build those qualifications that develop those better returns as you move through and build your career. But actually, right now, if you're going to stay on that apprenticeship minimum wage rate until the age of 19, which it's possible to keep young people on, whereas if you're in a non-apprenticeship job and you can get a better wage rate at the age of 18, I think we could see more non-completion as young people actually follow the money because their circumstances really require that they do in this kind of rising inflationary context.
I think, yeah, there's really interesting points, really, isn't it? I think it's stepping back. What we said, a couple of things is create a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? If you know what I mean. So it's like, do employers see apprentices to be a cheap labour source? So when it's coming down to deliverables and Christmas, if you're in retail, or or in hospitality, do you sort of see that person as a cheap resource, or do you see them as future skills pipeline for you for staff for the future? And if you're really investing in them, if you're a business, then it takes an awful lot of investment to be able to deliver interns. So I think it's maybe unpicking that a little bit, but at the same time, as how do you deliver against that? Like, how do you if you're a small business and say you're trying to do all your stuff that you're trying to do anyway, you're doing your accounts in the evening, you're trying to do, like as Aidan said, your comms and your PR at the same time of like serving a customer and all this sort of stuff, and you're also trying to develop a young person, they should have some sort of incentive, really. And and that's also going to be dropping down. I mean, What do you sort of see could be the solution to that? I don't know, Aidan, Michael, any thoughts on sort of unpicking that a little bit and coming up with some solutions really for people?
Well, like Becci, I wrote a lot about pay in the CFL booklet, and I think actually the Low Pay Commission estimates about a third of 16 to 18-year-olds are actually getting the apprentice rate. It's quite interesting when you dig into the LPC analysis about what the mean rate of pay is for the various age groups. But actually, I've reached the conclusion that we should just get rid of the apprentice rate altogether and just peg it to the youth rates that the LPC's has. I think the LPC is coming out with its recommendations for next April fairly soon, but I would like to. I think it drags down the reputation of the program. It doesn't help, so I would just get rid of it altogether, despite what the mean rates are of apprentices, which actually, if you look across the groups as a whole, is pretty encouraging. It makes apprenticeships an attractive option, but as long as the apprentice rate stays there, it is an unwelcome distraction and doesn't help the reputation of the program.
But with thinking of sort of quality and off the job, if we increase the amount of salary that an apprentice get, would that reduce the amount of off the job that they get? Because you're the same, being paid the same as a normal member of staff, then I want you to work 100%, not.
Well, the rules are very clear, Gavin, that on off the job is that they have to be done in contracted hours.
Exactly. So you're increasing their wage. Would that not mean that some employers will be like, well, I'm not going to be able to do it's that puzzle, isn't it? Like it's like, how do you do the differentiator on that?
But really, I think if you look at the LPC analysis, it's only sort of a couple of sectors, hairdressing being the obvious one, where the apprentice rate can be a real challenge to the small business that you're talking about. I think most businesses would be able to adjust to it. But if it'd be interesting to see if there are any providers watching. You might put something in the comments to say he's talking rubbish. But yeah, I think it's something that employers could absorb. And let's face it, the youth rates aren't exactly mind-blowing in terms of adding costs. So in terms of adjustment, I think that it can be done. But an unwelcome distraction, get rid of it.
I think it's fair to say, though, 40% of apprenticeships are advertised where they go to advert at the sort of apprenticeship minimum wage rate. So there's a lot of businesses using this. And, we've done some other employer research recently, and there's just an assumption amongst some employers that you have to pay the minimum wage rate to young people. I'm not talking about the apprenticeship one, like over a certain age, so you have to pay that. No, you don't. You can pay above that rate, and I think for young people, they question the quality of apprenticeships when you're getting paid such a low rate. Is this a good quality job? So yeah, I do tend to lean towards, I'd like to agree, that we raise that to the kind of 16 to 18 standard minimum wage rate. I think we might need to put a bit more in for some small employers. I was looking back, the apprenticeship grant in 2013 was offering 1,500 to small. I was actually giving it to quite large employers, frankly, and sort of local authorities were adding to those incentives, and it really could help employers manage some of the increases they're seeing while keeping young people in training. But I'd really want to make sure that was good quality training with the off-the-job element, so that we do see those returns to society and the economy that learned colleagues calculate on the basis of achieved qualifications. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, if I could just say, Gavin, one of the things, of course, since Becci and I wrote our piece is that just to show how quickly the sector moves on. We've got Keegan and Halfon back in the department. We've just had the Labour Party proposals, and then we've had the funding rate increases this week. Now, the Labour Party proposals, of course, are talking about the return of the education maintenance allowance. Now,
Yep.
whether that would get past Rachel Reeves as the heart, as the guardian of Prudence's return, I don't know. But it'd be interesting to see whether Labour would bring that back, and in relation to all those points that Becci's just made about living at home and so on, because whether they'd bring that back for apprentices, I don't know. But obviously that would have to get past Rachel Reeves.
I think we've had a comment come in as well, so I'll just bring that in from Mohammed, and he's saying that, I guess the question is, what other quality incentives are there for apprentices and employers other than money? I think that's a really good point, because we have focused a bit on the money. You're right there, Mohammed. And I think you've made an interesting point as well, Becci, around levy paying employers are obviously taking the data is showing us they're sort of already existing staff, and they're already quite well paid anyway. But SMEs, particularly if their costs are going up, and we want to increase the amount of apprenticeships, then it would make sense that we would return back to that incentive, really. Moving on from money, talking about money a lot. I know it's cost of living is key in there, but can we talk about providers? Because a lot of providers are also going through challenging times at the moment as well, and we talk about all providers, so colleges, independent training providers, but I think it's just a bit of a sort of distinction here. It's a bit like when we're talking about all apprenticeships and all employers. It's very different if you're like GlaxoSmithKline compared to someone who's working in a pharmacy. It's very, very different, and I think also there's really large independent training providers, and there's others which are a small niche and are beautifully formed. Aidan, you understand ITPs inside out. How are the rising costs affecting ITPs in particular, and colleges as well?
Yeah, I mean, the important thing to remember about ITPs is that they're a business. So we've just been talking about employers. They're affected like any other business by the things that we've been talking about. And they've been lobbying for some time to get the government to look at the funding rates of some apprenticeship standards, which they feel are too low, the impact of inflation. And don't forget, ITPs, of course, don't get any capital funding. So if you're talking about STEM and things like automotive and things like that, the funding of facilities and premises, that all has to come at the investment for that, all has to come out of the margin. So that's a big difference between ITPs and colleges offering apprenticeships. And the message has got home, because of course at the autumn conference on Tuesday, Peter Mutlow and Jen Coupland got up and said that they were going to bring in what they called temporary increases to funding rates until IFATE have reviewed the funding rate for each specific standard. So hopefully there'll be some good news there for providers, because there has been a question mark over for how long, particularly at the sort of lower level apprenticeships, things like care, which is on £3,000, things like that, critical sector, how sustainable some of these apprenticeships provision is for providers. So hopefully some good news there. And the one thing I would say about all that, of course, is that if they do bring in increases, that all gets paid for out of the levy. And so that's further pressure on the levy.
Yeah, I mean, we've danced around the levy a bit. Did you want to unpack anything more about the levy or people's views on the levy? Because Blunkett, I chatted with him before he did his release, actually, because he was at the FAB conference, and he's a nice guy. Stately, I would say, is Blunkett. Well, I think that's what we've been missing a bit with people in policy of late, stately and considered. But he was interestingly talking about a couple of different things where I want to step into it in a bit when we're looking on a global. But let's the levy. What's your sort of views on what's happening with it? 'Cause there's a bit of confusion still about the levy, isn't there? Do you know what I mean? It's been apprenticeship levy is always equaled a bit of confusion, to be fair, from the get-go. So, anyone got any views on the levy and how this can sort of be utilised maybe in a different way or be rethought? We've got, like you said, we've got the dream team in, haven't we? You know, we've got Rishi, who's thinking about apprenticeships when he was the Chancellor, who's now the Prime Minister. We've got Gillian Keegan, who's now Education Secretary, actually someone who's in Education Secretary roles who actually understands what skills are, rather than just thinking purely about schools. And we've got Rob Halfon, he's just kept going, hasn't he? You know, he's just been really doing some really fundamentally cool stuff. I'm full of hope. So if we was to be full of hope, what could we be thinking about that dream team come together to think about the levy? What would you want to see?
I'm happy to kick off on this one, Gavin. So I know NCFE and I believe ALP agree on this point that, you know, that there's the 16 to 18 funding of apprenticeships from the levy pot doesn't really make sense. It's not in line with the rest of funding. Everything else under 18 is centrally funded by government, and particularly if we're potentially looking at extending the levy to fund other forms of training, we believe there should be a ring-fence pot for under 18-year-olds to make sure that it's one of those viable options. You know, at the Sainsbury report, it was always envisaged you could go the academic route, the technical route, or an apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship route is more and more year on year as we see those opportunities for 16 and 17-year-olds start to dwindle, becoming a theoretical route rather than a practical one. So I think that would be a good start, is to protect that funding for that age group. The other point I'd want to make is really, you know, obviously employers putting a huge amount of pressure on government to extend that and, you know, make the levy more flexible to be able to spend on other forms of training. And I think we should treat that with a little bit of caution, because, of course, anything spent on other forms of training very much would come at the expense of apprenticeship opportunities as a whole. So, you know, it is a very delicate ecosystem. And I think more work needs to be done to really understand the consequences of what any change would result in there.
Yep, definitely. Anyone else want to sort of jump in on levy, or if you had a magic wand, what would you want to see?
For me, it's interesting. So, you know, and sort of thinking back to Sainsbury and sort of before, and the kind of idea of co-investment. And what we're seeing is employers over time have done less and less training. You know, it's like they give employees health and safety training, they do induction training, but they're not doing that sort of skills development to enable that progression in work. And of course, that impacts on productivity. So I don't think, you know, like beyond the money, that we are truly seeing that co-investment. And, you know, we've seen the levy kind of be used in ways that weren't anticipated. You know, and you know, personally, I think it's fine for an existing worker if they need that full set of skills to move to their next level. Entirely appropriate for an apprenticeship for that, but I do think there should be other models available for other forms of progression. And actually, you know, employers previously were investing in some of the MBAs that got transferred into the levy funding, so it didn't do what we thought. I like the idea of protecting the 16 to 18 out of standard budget, and then, you know, really thinking about good quality, full standards where they're needed. I think for adults in work, actually, we probably need more flexible models. We need employers to be part of investing in those. We can't allow them to sort of skirt that, you know. But whether the levy is entirely the right use, I think, you know, if we want it to be an apprenticeship levy, that's what it should be.
Yeah. Thank you, Becky. Aidan, anything?
Yeah, I mean, what we're lacking is a really transparent debate about what should happen with the levy. Because, I mean, obviously there's discussions going on behind closed doors between DFE and the Treasury, and we mustn't forget the levy is the Treasury's baby. So things like levy transfer schemes, which was, for example, which was supposed to support SMEs in the supply chain. At one point, over 50% of levy transfers were going to levy payers. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. But what I think they need to do is they need to sit down. The ministers need to sit down and decide exactly what they want to get out of the levy. So some of the priorities that Michael and Becci have just alluded to, 16 to 18. I mean, Halfon spoke about last year, talked about paying the wages of SME apprentices out of the levy. So that would be another demand. Robert Halfon is also, as we know, a big champion of degree apprenticeships. He wants to rocket boost them, but that costs a lot of money, And so you've just got to decide what your priorities are, because until this economic downturn arrived, the sort of 2019 pressures that we saw when we had an NAO report and a Public Accounts Committee hearing on the projected levy overspend, the same pressures were coming back. The numbers are going up. I've got the numbers in front of me in terms of start numbers were coming back. And I know, although they haven't publicly published the figures, I know for a fact that there was no underspend for full year 21-22. It was less than 1%. And so all those arguments about what to do with levy underspend, they're for the birds now, quite honestly, unless we have a big recession, when, of course, there is a danger of underspend again. But you've just, all those sort of things that, for example, Becci was just talking about, whether, how much the levy is spent on high-level apprenticeships or for existing members of staff, as opposed to being used for young apprentices as recruits. We need to have a proper debate about that, and whether, for example, the co-investment tool, the employer co-investment tool, should be used to rebalance how the levy is spent.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think it also all depends, I suppose, if we have a change of government again, and then if we go to into like potentially, could it be a coalition? Could it be a different? It's just, we're in a really strange time at the moment. I think.
Toby said, Fraser, that at the Labour Party launch, because he got questioned about it, because he's been quite keen on the funding of SME apprenticeships. And he said, we will do that, we will do that. Well, that raises interesting questions. Will they do that, be able to do that from the levy? Or will they have to go to Rachel Reid and say, can we separately fund this? So, big questions.
I think it's really interesting. We're totally over on time, but I think we could probably speak about this for hours and hours and hours. I think it's really interesting. I want to I'm in Singapore. I mean, you can probably see that in the background, all lit up. I was at a really interesting summit where it was ILO, OECD, UNICEF, UNESCO, Singapore government, Australian government. There's 4 governments here as well, and it was interesting that there's a couple of things which have come up. And Aidan, something you mentioned, care is seen to be globally to be one of the major things that we've got to support, because we've got an aging population. Depends where you are. If I was talking to Indian people over here, they're saying they got like the exact opposite. They've got like a massively huge young generation coming up, and what do they do with those? But care is an incredibly important area for people. And like you're saying, Aidan, giving £3,000 to be able to do a development course for someone to actually look after. Well, do you want someone just to get paid peanuts to then be trained to be able to do what you can do? I think probably not. And I think also another massive thing that come out over and over and over again was SMEs. If Anthony Impew's on here, he'd want it to be called small businesses, because they're a little bit different to each other. A small business to a medium size, but everyone across the globe is thinking around how do they support their SMEs, and particularly how do they help them to be able to upskill, reskill, and how can big business learn from the innovation of small business. And I think that's something that's particularly interesting. So I think if we're looking around cost of living crisis and apprenticeships, how are we supporting our SMEs? Because that's just being said by every single government I've met this week, which has been a few. And if we also look at OECD, they're seeing before the pandemic 282 million global needs. That how do you then take people out of the cost of living crisis? So it's not you're actually helping people progress in their career around an apprenticeship, but also at the same time you're giving them the tools to be able to do that. And I think that one of the major things that come up over and over again, and everything that everyone said, was time and money. How can we give people time so it's relevant what they're doing? So we're talking quality of provision. So if we're talking about salaries and stuff like, it isn't that people don't think that they're a cheap resource as an apprentice, that they give them time to be developed and to launch their career, or a midpoint through their career to keep going. But also money. How do you then make sure that you're equipping everyone? I just think it's interesting to get that from a global perspective as well. I've got videos I could play, but we're late. I'm not going to do it. I'm probably the most interesting person I met was a guy from Cardiff University. Since I'm based in Exeter, a little bit weird to be in Singapore meeting someone I could have met across the River Severn, but he's an interesting professor around the future of work in particular. And what is interesting is the cost of living crisis as well is a European thing, from what I'm understanding. I thought it's for everyone. It's actually a European thing, and it's like how we managing our processes when we get there. And I think that we've got this unique opportunity where we can think of apprenticeships in a different way, isn't it? Like how can we develop people? How can we make sure we're supporting SMEs? How can we make sure we haven't touched on it, Michael, but awarded organisations and charities are being affected by the cost of living crisis as well, and like how much does it cost to develop a course and a qualification and accredit it? I just think there's so much to be covered here, and I just thank everyone for your time that you're taking out today, audience for listening in. We're over. I might as well ask one more question. If everyone had a magic wand and could have one thing that they would want to be able to see for cost of living crisis and for the future of apprenticeships, this season's all about the future of apprenticeships, what would you want to see? Michael, what would you want to see?
So I think I'd like to see the government sit down and take a real holistic look from a learner perspective at how, the best way we can support people. And I think, just to give an example, there's a lot of regional disparity at the moment. So, for example, if you're a prospective apprentice growing up in Cumbria, as opposed to growing up in Greater Manchester, first of all, you've got a lot more choice in a metropolitan area. But after that, there's significant challenges even getting to and from an apprenticeship with things like travel. Whereas in Greater Manchester, through the Combined Authority and that devolved deal, all 16, 18-year-olds have a free bus pass for public transport. So, a lot of the barriers are instantly taken away there. And I think, there's not enough really done to sit down and think about some of those regional disparities, think about some of the things that are working around the country, because there's some really, really good examples of best practice and some potential really good quick wins there. So it's not just that siloed policy making where we look at this from an education perspective. Let's take the learner's whole life and think about the different ways we can support them across the piece.
Aidan, anything you'd like to add? What would be your magic one moment?
I mean, I would support what Michael said about the learner. So I would add about protecting SME apprenticeships. I think they've got to work out a way. I mean, there's currently a 10 cap starts in a year on medium-sized businesses, which the department's got to continue to manage for the foreseeable future because of the pressures on the levy. So there's got to be a solution, both Conservative and Labour, to work out how they fund SME apprenticeships. One thing, can I quickly add, Gavin, as you're in Singapore, is, of course, Singapore is the home of skills future credits. And
I was going to add that in. Very interesting in what they're doing with their... I've got a video coming on that, Aidan.
Yes, bring it back,
I interviewed the CEO who set that up. He's actually the guy who set it up. He didn't say that, but he was the guy who set it up.
David Plunkett was talking about it last week again. So, and I can remember all the ruckus that went on with the Labour's first experiment with it, but there were mistakes made then. But the principle is sound. So, bring back the ideas from Singapore, Gavin. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, I've got a thing. I'm going to do something in the background there, Aidan. Don't worry about that. Adding to that, and then Becci, I'll jump because it is very interesting. Is that they've also they start people with those credits as well to be able to do any learning, to be able to get them into into actually thinking about learning and having time to learn and to actually have the joy of learning. And they've very got like this agile mindset of to learn, unlearn and relearn is what their skills minister was talking about, and to be able to make people quickly be able to get there. Their productivity is huge. So I think that's something we could learn as well. Anyway, Becci, what would you have as your magic wand moment?
Well, I'd certainly agree that the ability to learn is the core skill that we all need to move through our careers, and I think we do need to sort of promote that learning. I also was thinking about a sort of more local response to this, because I think it's a complex landscape. If we do want more SMEs engaged, we have to make that easier for them. It's not straightforward. I think the combined authorities, sub-regional bodies, provide us with a structure that we're not exploiting sufficiently well. I liked Michael's example of Greater Manchester there. We also know we've got the local skills improvement plans going on. We've had skills development accelerator funds, all these things. Actually, if we could put some connections in place, some local brands to bring local businesses, so they've got something they can recognise and get to, and there can be career support for young people to think about the choices that face them, and for apprenticeships to be a realistic opportunity, because we still hear too many stories that young people just weren't told about apprenticeships. And if we want to see a more productive economy, we want to see better skills, and those skills need to be learned in an applied setting. So we really do need to create those opportunities, and I think some local branding could really help towards that and reduce complexity for all involved.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the stream today. I think, it's always a weird one when you're talking about money, really. And the thing is, it's been stretched, isn't it? And I think it's a really interesting point around how do we support learners, but at the same time, how do we make sure we increase, quality? People have got to do really more off the job and be, more aggressive. One thing I learned from this in Singapore as well, micro credentials is a massive thing for ILO, OECD, Singapore government, massive. I think there could be a really big scope to better increase micro credentials on top of apprenticeships, to better maybe do things in a different way for people. Really interesting, some of the stuff that's going on with that. But SMEs globally, like these international players are telling us we need to support our SMEs. We need to support our SMEs. How are we going to go about doing that, particularly when they're increasing costs? But thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next week we've got episode 4, and it's all around SEND. It's going to be at 10 o'clock Thursday, the 10th of November. And this is time also to say thank you. This is a totally co-produced live stream, so this is between NCFE and FE News. So Sam, Lindsay, thank you so much for getting everything together in the background. Michael, thank you as well. And also all of the contributors to the Campaign for Learning report. Really interesting report. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. Yeah, I know there's 17 articles in there, not too long. And I think it's some really, really interesting stuff in there, different dimensions and perspectives. Also, thank you to Team FE News as well. So thank you to Finley, thank you to Holly, thank you to Danielle, and also all of those are apprentices, which are putting together a future of apprenticeship program. So thank you, everyone, for putting this together today. We'd love to see you next week. And thanks for joining us today. And if it's your evening or if it's your morning, I hope you have a really, really fantastic day. And thanks for joining us.